Europeans did not discover the land we now occupy. It was inhabited for thousands of years prior to their arrival. Among the indigenous tribal nations that lived here in Connecticut, 5 are still officially recognized. Our congregations occupy the ancestral and contemporary lands of these nations. We begin our service each week by acknowledging these facts and commit to educating ourselves while affirming the sovereignty, history, and experience of our neighbors.
My blood doth rise in the roots of yon oak, her sap doth run in my veins, boundless my soul like the open sky, where the stars forever have reigned. Where the stars, where the stars, where the stars forever have reigned. My hands hold the weavings of time without end, my sight as deep as the sea, beating my heart as the measures of all that have lost eternity. That of love, that of love, that of love's eternity. I feel the tides as they answer the moon, rushing on a far distant sand, bringing my song is the wind of my breast, and my love goes over the land. And my love, and my love, and my love goes over the land. My foot carries days of the old into new, our dreaming shows us the way. Wondrous our faith settles deep in the earth, writing green to bring a new day. Rising green, rising green, rising green to bring a new day.
Good morning. I'm the Reverend Tony Lorenzen, the minister here at the Unitarian Universalist Church in Meriden, and along with our sister congregation, the Mattituck Unitarian Universalist Society, I am happy to welcome you to our online service this morning. We are very glad you could join us. We will be continuing our monthly theme of story this morning as we take a look at the other side of the story, the untold part of the story, a different perspective on the story, so that we have a better understanding of what it's like when we have the whole story and those times when we don't. We begin, as we always do, lighting the symbol of our faith tradition, the flaming chalice. May this flame light our way to a better understanding of the whole story, that we might hear the parts we sometimes do not hear, that we might see the parts we sometimes do not see.
We are living beneath the great big dipper. We are washed by the very same rain. We are swimming in the stream together, some in power and some in pain. We this ground we walk on, cherishing the beings that we live beside. Loving spirits will live forever. We're all swimming to the other side. I am alone and I am searching, hungering for answers in my time. I am balanced on the brink of wisdom. I'm impatient to receive a sign. I move forward with my senses open. Imperfection to be my crime. In humility I will listen. We're all swimming to the other side. On this journey through thoughts and feelings, finding intuition my heart. I am gathering the tools together. I'm preparing to do my part. All of those who have come before me, band together and be my guide. Loving lessons that I will follow. We're all swimming to the other side. When we get there, we'll discover all of the gifts you've been given to share. Have been with us since life's beginning, and we never noticed they were there. We can balance on the brink of wisdom, never recognizing that we are right. Loving spirits will live together. We're all swimming to the other side.
We are living neath the great big dipper. We are washed by the very same rain. We are swimming in the stream together, some in power and some in pain. We can worship this ground we walk on, cherishing the beings that we live beside. Loving spirits will live forever. We're all swimming to the other side.
We're all swimming to the other side.
Would you be a good eyewitness? You've probably seen one of these experiments on a television program or a video or somewhere on the internet, where a group of people are asked to closely watch a scene transpire in front of them, and then they're asked about the details afterwards. And to their surprise, most people find they couldn't remember a lot of the details very well. Let's see how you do with one of these experiments. I'm going to show you about 20 seconds of a casual scene in the outdoor seating section of a cafe. Then we'll see how good you were at observing details. Get ready. Let's see how observant you were. I'm going to ask you some questions about the cafe scene. If you want to, you can write down your answers. How many people were in the cafe? How many were women? How many were people of color? How many were wearing hats? How many wore glasses? Which person drinks from their cup or glass? Which person was stirring their drink? Where was the bicycle? Was there trash on the floor? How many people were in the cafe? 7. How many were women? 5. How many were people of color? 1. How many were wearing hats? 2. How many wore glasses? Just one. How many wore red shoes? Looks like 2. Which person drinks from their cup or glass? The woman in the hat to the black woman's left. The black woman picked up her cup but never drank from it. Where was the bicycle? On the back wall. Was there trash on the floor? No, it was leaves on the floor. So how did you do? Would you make a good eyewitness? Would you see the whole story? Would you remember it?
Most of us know the poem Casey at the Bat by Ernest Lawrence Thayer, which has as its last stanza,
"And now the pitcher holds the ball, and now he lets it go, and now the air is shattered by the force of Casey's blow. Oh, somewhere in this favored land the sun is shining bright. The band is playing somewhere, and somewhere hearts are light, and somewhere men are laughing, and somewhere children shout. But there is no joy in Mudville. Mighty Casey has struck out."
Well, that's a pretty sad ending, but it is only one perspective on what happened that day when the Mudville Nine played against the Dustburg team. Garrison Keillor thought about writing a poem maybe from the other team's perspective. The outlook was brilliant for the Dustburg fans that day. We were winning 4-2 with an inning left to play. We got Coney on a grounder and Muldoon on the same. 2 outs, none on, top of the 9th. We thought we'd won the game. Mudville was despairing, but we grinned and cheered and clapped to think that after all these years, our losing string had snapped. We only wished that Casey, that big fat ugly lout, would be the patsy who would make the final shameful out. Oh, how we hated Casey. He was a blot upon the game. Every dog in Dustburg barked at the mention of his name. He was a bully and a braggart, a cretin and a swine. If Casey came to bat, we'd stick it where the moon don't shine. But with 2 outs and Flynn at bat and Jimmy Blake at deck, the former was a loser and the latter was a wreck. And though the game was in the bag, the Dustburg fans were hurt to think that Casey would not come and get his just dessert. But Flynn cut loose a single, a most unlikely sight, and Blake swung like a lady, and he parked it deep to right. And when the dust had settled and fickle fate had beckoned, there was Flynn a hugging third, and Jimmy safe at second. And from every Dustburg throat arose a mighty cry, "Send up the slimy greaseball, and let him stand and die. Throw the mighty slider, and let him hear it whiz, and let him hit a pop-up like the pansy that he is." There was pride in Casey's visage as he strode across the grass. There was scorn in his demeanor as he went to scratch his 10,000 Dustburg fans hooted as he stepped into the box, and they made sounds like when he bent to fix his socks. And then came the mighty slider, spinning towards the plate, and Casey watched it spinning, but he did not go for it. And the umpire jerked his arm like he was hauling down the sun, and the cry rang out from the toilets to the box seats, "Strike 1!" 10,000 Dustburg fans made such a mighty cheer, the pigeons in the rafters cracked and ruined all the beer. "You stupid, lazy, ignorant, rotten son of a gun," we yelled at the mighty Casey, and then came the second one. It was a hero's fastball, and it came across the plate, and according to the umpire, it was doing 98. And according to him, it came in straight and true, and the cry rang out from the toilets to the box seats, "Strike 2!" 10,000 Dustburg fans arose in joyful loud derision to question Casey's salary, his manhood, and his vision. And as the Dustburg pitcher put the rosin on the ball, 10,000 Dustburg fans hooted at the thought of Casey's fall. Oh, the fury in his visage as he spat tobacco juice and heard our little children screaming violent abuse. Casey bent down to kick the dirt from off his spikes and reached down to ease his pants. "What's the matter? Did you lose him?" cried a lady in the stands. And there the Dustburg pitcher stood, majestic on the hill. He leaned into the plate, and the crowd grew still. He went into his wind-up, kicked and let it go, and the air was shattered by the force of Casey's blow. He swung so hard his hair fell off, and he fell down in disgrace. And when the Dustburg catcher held up the ball, the crowd tore up the place. With Casey lying in the dirt amidst the boos and jeers, we threw wieners down at him and other souvenirs. We banged on top of the dugout roof as they carried him to the bench, and we went out to the parking lot and found a monkey wrench and took the lug nuts off the Mudville bus tires and attached some firecrackers to the alternator wires. We rubbed the doors and windows with a special kind of cheese that smelled like something died from an intestinal disease. Old Casey took his sweet time, but we were glad to wait, and we showered him with garbage as he came out through the gate. So happy were the Dustburg fans that grand and marvelous day, it took a dozen cops to help poor Casey get away. We grabbed on hold of the bumpers and we rocked him to and fro, and Casey cursed us from inside, and gosh, we loved it so. Oh, somewhere in America the sun is shining bright. Life seems joyful and everything seems right. But there is no joy so pure and sweet as the day the mighty Casey fell, demolished at our feet.
Our memory doesn't always give us the whole story. Sometimes it forgets things. And sometimes it remembers things that weren't there.
How good is your memory? Let's find out. I'm going to read you a list of 7 words. Grab something if you want to write them down. Let's see if you get the list correct. Ready? Here's the list. Unitarian, reversal, unification, salon, list, cyclist, universe, green. All right, now, let's see how you did. Ready? I'll read the list again, and you check off the word if you've written it down. Unitarian, reversal, unification, salon, list, cyclist, universe, green. Here's the list, so you can double check. Did you write down the word universalist? Universalist was not a word on the list. And yet I'm going to guess some of you, maybe even many of you, wrote down the word universalist. So your memory was faulty by association, because universalist sounds like a number of things on the list. And there are a number of things on the list that make your brain think that universalist will pair up with it. Unitarian, salon, list, reversal, universe, cyclist, and of course there was green.
The promise of the Spirit, faith, hope, and love abide. And so every soul is blessed and made whole. The truth in our hearts is our guide. We are standing on the side of love, and joined together as hearts beat as one, emboldened by faith, we dare to proclaim we are standing on the side of love. Sometimes we build a barrier to keep love tightly bound, corrupted by fear, unwilling to hear, denying the beauty we found. We are standing on the side of love, hands joined together as hearts beat as one, emboldened by faith, we dare to proclaim we are standing on the side of love. A bright new day is dawning, when love will not divide. Reflections of grace in every embrace, fulfilling the vision divine. We are standing on the side of love, hands joined together as hearts beat as one, emboldened by faith, we dare to proclaim we are standing on the side of love. We are standing on the side of love.
The Tribury Read program, an outgrowth of the Justice Southbury Initiative, has chosen as its first book Born a Crime by the comedian and host of The Daily Show, Trevor Noah. It is about Mr. Noah's early upbringing in South Africa, mostly in the time after apartheid had formally ended. Mr. Noah relates how it was very common among Africans to choose a name for themselves. I had that experience when I volunteered in East Africa in 1969 and became friends with a young student who took on his own middle name. He called himself Samuel Nixon Ouma. He wanted to be called Nixon. As a born and raised New York Democrat, that was a significant sacrifice on my part. One long story in Noah's book is about his early criminal career, where he illegally downloaded, or I would say stole, music and created pirated CDs with the latest music. Because he always had the latest hit music and the audio equipment to go with it, he and his friends were invited to many gatherings, which often included dance contests to see who had the best moves. Of Noah's friends, there was one who was heads and shoulders above the rest as a dancer. His chosen name was Hitler. At the dances, he and his friends would cheer him on, yelling, "Go, Hitler, go!" He chose it because he had learned that Germans fought the British, and he knew the British were colonialist oppressors. Although I could see the logic used to adopt the name Hitler, and putting aside that Germans were also pretty good at the overseas oppression game for many years before Hitler, I had trouble reading that chapter. Hitler is not a name to be used casually in the U.S. I was raised with stories, movies, and music that said when it comes to pure evil, you can't get worse than Hitler. Just a photo of him or a short video of him speak to a crowd makes my skin crawl. I have had conversations with UU friends about how to interpret our first principle in light of the reality of people like Hitler. Inherent worth and dignity of Adolf Hitler just does not feel right. When it comes to stories that form my understanding of the world, Hitler is a problem for me. Where does such evil come from? Was he born, as the blues song says, he was born bad to the bone? Or was he just another power-hungry politician who saw a way to rise above everyone else? Lots has been written about Hitler, but what I learned, or the stories I heard, did not address where his use of techniques to control populations so ruthlessly came from. It was more or less Hitler is and will always be evil. The story, however, has become more complicated as I got older. I have known for most of my adult life of the legacy of slavery of African Americans and the slaughter of American Indians. As UUs, we recognize that the heart of these atrocities is a violation of our first principle, inherent worth and dignity of every person. What I did not consider was that the stories of Jim Crow and lynching, even after slavery had legally ended, as well as the forced marches and butchering of American Indians, were known throughout the world. Whereas we might like to have seen these as aberrations, and something we do not dwell on when teaching U.S. history, Hitler and his followers were well aware of them and saw in them a model of how to remove, quote, unwanted, marginalized people. In Eric Larson's book, called In the Garden of the Beast, he notes the ongoing guidance that the U.S. ambassador to Germany received from our State Department to not bring up the harsh and violent treatment of the Jewish people for fear that the Germans will bring up U.S. treatment of African Americans in the U.S., including the lynching and terrorizing by the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s and 1930s. To quote from the comic strip Pogo, "We have met the enemy, and it is us." Of course, this does not excuse Adolf Hitler and his followers. It does, however, underscore the importance of President Biden's theme of leading by the power of our example rather than the example of our power.
A few weeks ago, I went to Simsbury, to the house of the CEO of Cigna Healthcare, and took part in a protest there. The CEO of Cigna told Governor Lamont here in Connecticut that he would encourage all the big insurance companies to get out of Connecticut if Connecticut passed a law that widened public access to public health care option, and that included undocumented immigrants. Now, I am a big supporter of universal health care for everybody, and it was a good event. But as I was walking up to the site of the protest from where I parked my car, I got into a conversation with another Unitarian Universalist who belonged to another congregation here in Connecticut, and he started going on about Christians in the Bible. Now, I'm a Unitarian Universalist, and even so, I'm not someone who hates the Bible. I think there's a lot of valuable things in it. I think it's important to be literate in the Bible, especially in our culture. And I listened to this guy do one of the usual teardowns of the Bible. You know, some people talk about this God of love, but then you read the Bible and it says, God said, go into this place and kill everybody there. You can't square that. A God of love doesn't do that. So I asked him, do you really believe that God, a God, the God, told somebody to go into that land and kill everyone there? No, somebody just wrote that as a story. Exactly. So why put that on God? If there is a God, why can't that God still be a God of love? There's always a different perspective to religion and spirituality. And sometimes we dismiss things that we don't agree with. We all do it. This is confirmation bias. It's our spiritual challenge for the month. Confirmation bias is when we tend to agree with information that supports or agrees with our view or our opinions of things. I get some information about how wonderful Bernie Sanders is, for example, in my politics, and I tend to be less questioning about it, right? So when we hear some information that criticizes something we believe in or something that we disagree with, this is awful. So it's confirmation bias. It's our spiritual challenge for the month. And confirmation bias is when we tend to be a little uncritically accepting of information that supports or agrees with our perspective or opinions. if I like a certain politician and I read a favorable news story, I'm much more likely to be uncritical of that story. Confirmation bias is also when we tend to be more critical and more dismissive of things that are in support of opinions and things we disagree with or a different perspective. So we all have to engage in this, right? One of the quotes we're promoting this month for our spiritual challenge is John Dominic Crossan's explanation of the Bible, that I keep telling people it's not that those ancient people wrote factual stories and then we were smart enough to interpret them symbolically, but rather they wrote them symbolically. And somewhere along the line, we got into our heads to take them literally. Right? And if we have a certain confirmation bias about what the Bible is or what Islam is, you know, we hold that in a certain light, positive or negative, and tend to be uncritical of praise for that. And we tend to dismiss any criticism of that, however valid it might be. So we are not that great at taking in the whole story. None of us are, a lot of the time, because of our confirmation bias. So our challenge again to you this month, especially, is to take a look at your own spiritual and religious story and to find the confirmation biases in it. Do you tend to be readily accepting of things that support your particular views on religion? And do you tend to dismiss things that might be critical of your particular views of religion? And the same is true for your own practices of spirituality. Take a look at that and see if you can do a little better at taking in the whole story and the entire spectrum of perspective when investigating religions, be they your Unitarian Universalism or someone else's Islam, and your spiritual practices, whether they be walking or writing or someone else's praying. I think if we examine our spiritual and religious confirmation biases, we will find ourselves more compassionate towards others.
I grew up idolizing the West. I'm not sure I knew what the West was, but it was more exciting, had more scenery, had better weather, and a sense of adventure than my life on Long Island, New York. Most of us realize the classic Western movies and TV shows were pure fiction, created out on the backlots of Hollywood. That did not stop me from being glued to my TV set to watch each week. And probably Roy and Dale, as well as the Lone Ranger and Tonto, helped to develop my sense of virtue and the greater good more than my rabbi. However, a very different fictional story of the West actually did more harm and has parallels to today's battle over climate change. I have recently become more aware of this as I prepare to go with friends on a 7-day rafting trip down the 277 miles of the Colorado River that goes through the Grand Canyon. As many of you know, the first white men and quite possibly the first men ever to successfully travel by water through the rapids of the Colorado River were led by John Wesley Powell, the one-armed Civil War soldier. Over the course of 3 months in the summer of 1869, they went from what is today southern Wyoming through Utah and into Arizona. Of the 10 men, 1 quit after a month, and 3 left to try to walk out of the Grand Canyon just 24 hours before the remaining 6 made it through the last rapids. Powell was a self-taught scientist who was a keen observer of the natural environment. And he soon realized that the conventional wisdom of the day, go west, young man, was not sustainable. In fact, earlier in the 1800s, the land west of what is now Missouri and east of California's coast was called the Great American Desert. But with the dawn of the railroad and the federal land policies like the Homestead Act, hundreds of thousands of settlers were encouraged to put a stake on 160 acres to start their own homestead. The brochures told the story of a land where, quote, rain follows the plow, unquote. That is, prominent scientists of the time said with sincerity, quote, by simply cultivating the arid soil, the local climate would change permanently. The number of rainy days would rise, and crops would burst out of the fertile ground, unquote. Following the Civil War, the population of Nebraska, Kansas, and Colorado tripled. Powell's research told him a different story, and he had the facts to show the cyclical nature of decades of no rain followed by some rain. He predicted that the land could not support agriculture, and definitely not on a small parcel of only 160 acres. At a meeting of the National Academy of Sciences in 1877, he attacked the federal land management policy and called, quote, rain follows the plow, unquote, as nonsense. He was attacked and belittled by politicians and railroad tycoons who saw Western expansion as key to economic growth. Sound familiar? In 1890, Powell spoke out again when he unveiled a very unconventional map of this arid land. Rather than straight lines to demark state boundaries, he argued for using watersheds as the basis. Quote, he explained the importance of keeping water within watersheds, tying water legally to the land it flowed within, creating independent communities within the watersheds, and limiting federal involvement in local decisions about water usage. Powell's warning was not heeded. By the mid-1890s, the droughts had devastated Western agriculture and the local economy, forcing upwards of 50% of the settlers to flee their homesteads. Instead of listening to Powell, the new savior was extensive irrigation projects based on pulling up water from deep aquifers that formed over millions of years. Powell again saw the future and spoke plainly about, quote, piling up a heritage of conflict and litigation over water rights, for there is not sufficient water to supply these lands, unquote. He foresaw the endless litigation, the infrastructure costs, and the vicious political fights over water that would be caused by this unsustainable approach. We now understand how correct Powell was in his assessment of the land and the fallout from the policies implemented to further economic activity. In his time, Powell was ridiculed and eventually dismissed from his position at the U.S. Geological Survey for his heresy. John Wesley Powell was an intrepid explorer, and what he and his crew did to make it through the Grand Canyon will always live on. But now that I know the rest of the story and his understanding of the interconnected web, I can only hope that more people will know about his groundbreaking insights into how best to develop the West. The lessons obviously apply to how we use the science of global climate change to forge our future.
When I was a boy growing up, somewhere around the age of 8 years old, I noticed that I had a rocking chair in my room. It was an antique my mom had picked up. Don't think it was in that great a condition, and we sometimes sat in it. Didn't get it much use as I got a little older and bigger, but it was there, and I noticed one night that it started rocking and I wanted it to stop, and I would put my hand on it and it would stop. Didn't think much of it. Why was the chair rocking? This went on for a few nights, and one night I woke up in the middle of the night to a loud noise. It was the chair rocking back and forth, banging, and I went to put my hand on it to stop it, and it would not stop. And I got up out of bed and I ran down the hall to my mom's room screaming. She came back in, turned on the lights, and went over the chair and put her hands on it, and it stopped. My mom contacted a priest, a psychic. Everybody told her to get rid of the chair. I don't know if there was anything going on with that chair or not, but I still don't know what happened with that rocking chair when I was a child. My mom will tell you that she's seen angels and still does. Columns of light will appear in her bedroom, in her closed apartment, in the living room while she's watching TV. They seem to bring a great sense of calm and peace while they're there. She's not scared by them. To her, they are angels. What they are, I have no idea. I know what you're thinking. Say what? The Unitarian Universalist minister deals in the paranormal, in disembodied things, rocking chairs and angels and whatnot? Well, yes, a little bit. I mean, even the New Yorker is running a piece on UFOs now. The scientific evidence obtained through a lot of rigorous controlled studies actually points to, well, that there are enough significant anomalies so that we can't say conclusively that many of these things we'd call paranormal really aren't there. A few years ago, I read a great book by a guy named Steve Volk called Fringeology. The subtitle, How I Tried to Explain Away the Unexplainable and Couldn't. This guy was a journalist, and the book recounts various areas of the paranormal and various stories, and he reports on what we know and what we don't yet know about various phenomena, such as UFOs, ESP, lucid dreaming, prayer, ghosts, life after death. And the most fascinating takeaway for me from reading his account was that the unscientific people, the scientific people, the skeptics, and the materialists, and how unscientific they were in their defense of their belief in science that was largely emotional. And I found this really interesting. Now, how's that for flipping the sides of the story? In case after case, Volk reports, people doing the most scientific controlled studies are supporters of paranormal happenings, at the very least supporters of investigating further. They are also, he found, very modest about their findings when they do actual controlled legitimate studies. When the studies for the existence of ESP and telepathy report statistical anomalies above the rate of chance, they do not make a claim that ESP or telepathy exists, rather that we don't really know what's going on. But something is happening that's giving those who claim to have this ability a rate far above what random chance would predict. Brain scans taken while people are speaking in tongues, Volk reports, show that they're not crazy, nor are they hallucinating or faking or just making it up. Studies in lucid dreaming find that people can actually be taught to control dreams. As far as we know yet, the brain scans aren't lying to us. There even seems to be some type of legitimacy, at least some unanswered questions, about claims of after-death experiences or near-death experiences. The science doesn't so much prove that these are due to random brain firings, the brain shutting down, or other explanations favored by skeptics. The science seems to show something is happening, and we can't say for certain what it is. More intriguing to me than the reports of the paranormal are the philosophical conflicts between, say, the paranormalists, the spiritualists, and the materialist skeptics. You would think that the scientists and skeptics would be the rational ones, but sociological studies have been done on the conflict between skeptics and paranormal researchers to find out how they conducted their experiments and was it scientific enough. And what they found is the people who were the scientists and the skeptics were almost like what they called scientific vigilantes in the sociological studies, who do not hold scientific degrees but appoint themselves guardians of true science. Trevor Pinch, one of the sociologists involved in that study, says the findings surprised him. He expected to find skeptics were correct in their belief that parapsychologists and paranormal investigators were self-deceived and used shoddy experiments with poor control techniques just so they could prove their assumptions. And what he found was the opposite, that the parapsychology and paranormal researchers took skeptics seriously, conducting experiments according to methods that kept pace with the most rigorous of the psychological sciences. Pinch said, these were qualified, sincere researchers doing serious work, and they always had to deal with this group of people, skeptics, that were essentially engaged in what he calls, quote, a lot of name-calling. Perhaps the most damning condemnation of the skeptics and materialists is the case of the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. Now, this group requires for proof for the paranormal what is beyond what the scientific method calls for in order to admit a positive result, such as requiring a subject purported to have ESP get 5 out of 7 correct instead of 4 out of 7 correct, which is also a very remarkable hit rate. And this Committee for Scientific Investigation of the Paranormal claimed the subject a failure or a fraud because it didn't meet the 5 out of 7 success rate, but it did meet the 4 out of 7 success rate, which is still above the rate of chance. At the very least, the example points to something going on. And when asked for their own scientific studies disproving ESP and telepathy, the researchers who were part of the Committee for Scientific Investigation of the Paranormal said their records were informal and now gone. That's not very scientific for the scientists. When atheist Richard Dawkins talks about the World Trade Center bombings, he claims that not only is religious faith wrong and stupid, it leads to death, dying, and destruction much more than non-religious basis for such attacks. He said religion and faith are wrong and stupid and also deadly because it gives people too much confidence in their own righteousness. An actual study of the data of suicide bombings reveals religion is not a prime motivator for such acts of terrorism. Robert A. Pape's book, Dying to Win, is a report on a study of 384 suicide bombings between 1983 and 2003. 57% of those bombings were perpetrated by self-proclaimed secular groups. His paper, Cutting the Fuse, published in 2010, draws on an even larger database of suicide bombings and confirms his earlier findings that nationalism and foreign occupation are major motivations for suicide bombings, not religion. 8 years ago, I preached a sermon about the paranormal at a congregation in Texas where I was guest preaching. And I related to them some of the things I just told you. After the service, a man came up to me who had been attending services at this UU congregation but still was not a member. He seemed very elderly. He was tall and thin and had long white hair and a long white beard and spoke with a heavy, heavy accent when he spoke English. It seemed to me, not knowing languages and accents all that well, that it was East European, maybe Russian. It was Russian. He told me a bit about his life story. He now worked in a lab at a hospital on blood tests and whatnot. But in the Soviet Union, when he was a young man, he was actually a medical doctor. In the 1960s, he defected. One of the things he had done while a physician in the Soviet Union is he worked on a KGB-administrated project that studied the paranormal, he told me. His particular series of tests were on ESP and telepathy. The findings he got in his experiments were the same as reported by Volk. Just above 50% accuracy, above the rate of random chance. He said the people who claimed to have ESP were successful a lot of the time, more than you would think would be attributed to just chance. And the man told me, I don't know if they had ESP or could have mind reading, but I don't know they didn't either. I have to admit something was going on and I was perplexed. And he finished up, I still am. We don't always know the whole story. There are many things yet about which we don't know the whole story. And as Unitarian Universalists, it's our job to keep our mind and our hearts open.
Spirit of thy font, come to sing in thy heart, all stirrings of compassion, blow with the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, in life the shape of justice, roots hold me close, wings set me free, Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
We are reminded once again this week of the importance of loving our enemies as the conflict between Israel and Palestine erupts once again into violence and war. We fiercely and tenderly place our trust in the idea that every person deserves dignity and worth. We put our faith in the idea that everyone deserves respect and that there is no such thing as a lesser person. Should we lose this faith, there is no end to cycles of fear, cycles of hate, cycles of death. With love, we rehumanize each other. We combat the forces that make others enemies, monsters, lesser people. We keep our ears and our eyes and our minds open. We keep our hearts open for the other side of the story, the different perspective of the other side of disagreement that might allow us a chance at reconnection and healing. In the words of John O'Donohue, with respect and reverence that the unknown between us might flower into discovery and lead us beyond the familiar field, blind with weeds of weariness and old walls of habit. May all that is unforgiven in us be released. May our deepest fears yield their deepest tranquilities. May all that is unlived in us blossom into a future filled with grace.
Our joys and concerns online are the way we hold members of our community close to our hearts when we know they need our love and support. This week, we light candles for and hold in our hearts Becky Skinner and her husband, as her husband has entered hospice care. Paul Klein, also Donna Stimson's friend Michael, who is in a motorcycle accident. Stephen Nahas and his son Galen. Pat Stark's friend Christine, who is going through chemo. Connie Welton, who remains in rehab after a stroke. Reverends Tony and Tuesday as they prepare to be with Tuesday's family for her grandmother's funeral. The people of Israel and the people of Palestine, that their leaders may find ways to peaceful coexistence. All those whose lives have been lost or altered by COVID-19, all those living with cancer and recovering from surgeries, all those struggling with disease and illness, both visible and invisible. May the love of this community inspire us and strengthen us in our own life's journey. May the light of the chalice flame remind us that we are all part of the sacred fire of life and treasured members of this community. May we never forget that there is a love that tenderly and fiercely holds us all. Amen.
There is a love holding me. There is a love holding all that I love. There is a love holding all. I rest in this love. There is a love holding us. There is a love holding all that we love. There is a love holding all. We rest in this love.
Before we wrap things up, this morning we want to remind you to join us for coffee hour on Zoom after the service concludes. You can join us by going to go.uucentralct.org/coffee. One more time, go.uucentralct.org/coffee. Would love to see you there. Folks from both congregations in Woodbury and Meriden are hanging out and chatting about the service and other things, and we hope you can join us.
We've come to the end of our service. We hope this time with us has given you a chance to see the other side of the story, or the whole story, or the part of the story you did not know. We want to quickly remind you that there are a number of things coming up. We will be outside for service at Hollow Park in Woodbury on Sunday, May 23rd at 10:30. We will be here in the grounds of the UU Church in Meriden at 328 Paddock Ave in Meriden on Sunday, May 30th at 10:30. There are a couple of fundraising concerts going on at the UU Church in Meriden. We hope you can attend them. One is online on Thursday, May 20th at 7, and the other is here in person on June 5th at 4 p.m. We hope you can join us. As our service is ended, we extinguish our chalice flame, and we remind you to carry this fire with you in your heart. May it light your way so that you see the whole story, are more open to hearing and listening to the stories of others, and better able to more bravely live out your own story. Go in peace, holy ones. We'll see you next week.
From the light of days remembered burns a beacon bright and clear, guiding hands and hearts and spirit into faith set free from fear. When the fire of commitment sets our mind and soul ablaze, when our hunger and our passion meet to call us on our way, when we live with deep assurance of the flame that burns within, then our promise finds fulfillment and our future can begin. From the stories of our living still to witness to the life of liberty. When the fire of commitment sets our mind and soul ablaze, when our hunger and our passion need to call us on our way, when we live with deep assurance of the flame that burns within, then our promise finds fulfillment and our future can begin. From the dreams of youthful vision comes a new prophetic voice, which demands a deeper justice fueled by our courageous choice. When the fire of commitment sets our mind and soul ablaze, when our hunger and our passion need to call us on our way, when we live with deep assurance of the flame that burns within, then our promise finds fulfillment and our future can
Europeans did not discover the land we now occupy. It was inhabited for thousands of years prior to their arrival. Among the indigenous tribal nations that lived here in Connecticut, 5 are still officially recognized. Our congregations occupy the ancestral and contemporary lands of these nations. We begin our service each week by acknowledging these facts and commit to educating ourselves while affirming the sovereignty, history, and experience of our neighbors.